Welcome to Military Analytics. The Russian invasion, which Russian President Vladimir Putin defined as a special military operation, has completed its first year, and the war continues to shake the balance stones in the world. In the last days of the war, it is seen that the two armies plotted a major offensive plan. While the Russian army will try to encircle Kiev for the second time, hoping for the support of Belarus and Lukashenko from the north, the Ukrainian armed forces aims to clear both Donbass and Crimea from the Russian army. From this point, the war-changing geostrategic partners reinforce the power of the Ukrainian armed forces. Almost all NATO countries, especially the USA, provide the necessary support to Ukraine. However, among these countries, Israel, Poland, and Turkey need to be evaluated in a different field in terms of both strategic depth and extraordinary support. While Poland plays a key role for the security of Eastern Europe, Turkey appears as an ally of Ukraine as a geostrategic and political actor. In terms of the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, the Caucasus, and the Balkans. While this very special position of Turkey makes Turkey indispensable for both Ukraine and NATO, it is one of the biggest obstacles Russia faces. Now we will examine the importance of Turkey for Ukraine, the victories of Turkish war machines, and the ammunition on the Ukrainian fronts against the Russian army, and how it paved the way for the Ukrainian victory. In the early days of Russia's war against Ukraine, Turkey received justified praise from both Kiev and its Western allies for supporting Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, providing armed drones and closing the Turkish straits to Russian warships. Turkey's diplomatic efforts to ease its grain blockade in the Black Sea were also welcomed. Taking advantage of Turkey's geostrategic position, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, on the other hand, conned both sides in the Russian invasion of Ukraine and gained him the role of mediator. In addition, Turkey's arms supply has changed. Even the critical balance is in the war in terms of Ukraine's defense capabilities. Turkish drones played an important role in deterring the Russian attack, and the Crimean mine-resistant ambush-proof heavy armored vehicles delivered to the Ukrainian army were a complete game-changer in maintaining control of the terrain. When we look at the momentary situation on the front lines in Ukraine, we can clearly see how important Turkey's military support to Kiev is. If you remember, a huge military convoy, including Crimean armored vehicles sent by Turkey to the Ukrainian army, reached this hot front line from the Bakhmut highway towards the Donetsk region. From the moment the Turkish armored vehicles and special artillery munitions reached the Bakhmut front, clashes in the city suddenly turned in favor of Kiev. Now the situation in Bakhmut has reached a dead end for the Russians, thanks to the dozens of Crimean armored vehicles and 12 B-2 unmanned aerial vehicles that Turkey has provided to the Ukrainian armed forces. Currently the most critical city on the Ukrainian fronts is Bakhmut, and recently we saw Turkish armored vehicles enter Bakhmut and repulse the Russian troops trying to hold on to the outskirts of Bakhmut. The Russian military still regards Bakhmut as a holy cause, but critical aid from Ukraine's powerful allies and Ukraine's heroic soldiers are clearing the Russians even from the outskirts of Bakhmut. This big and striking move by Turkey has enabled the Ukrainian armed forces to now control close to 90% of the city of Bakhmut. On the other hand, Russian leader Vladimir Putin was completely cornered after Turkey's military aid to the Ukrainian army rather than Western aid. The statements made in the Kremlin that the Erdogan government's military support to Ukraine would still continue, which caused great concern, prompted the Kremlin and Russian leader Vladimir Putin to urgently seek support from Russia's allies. The fact that Russia could not achieve success in any aspect of Bakhmut except Sloviansk justified Vladimir Putin's concerns about Turkey. If you've noticed, the most recent joint simultaneous dawn operations and assault attempts of the Ukrainian armed forces and the Ukrainian border guards on the northern border lines of Bakhmut had driven the Russian occupation forces out of this area. The Ukrainian army used Turkish Crimean armored vehicles and Bayraktar unmanned aerial vehicles in these striking offensive operations and blockaded Bakhmut, which they saw as the eastern stronghold of the Russians. What the occupying army currently has as their only option in Sloviansk is an offensive corridor that is only 10 kilometers from Bakhmut. The use of Turkish war equipment in the Ukrainian armed forces changes not only the course of clashes in Bakhmut, but also all the balances in Donbass. This is because Russia's heavy blows in Bakhmut losing most of their front lines in the city make it easier for the Ukrainians to take control of both Donetsk and Luhansk because Bakhmut offers an eagle-eye perspective to both sides of the war. Well, what kind of effects did this eagle-eye view provided by Turkey to Ukraine have on the Russian side and in the diplomatic arena? As we've mentioned, we know that Russia opposes this aid and starts to seek additional military support, while the Russian leader, Vladimir Putin, continued to seek allies in this regard. He was also quite surprised that Turkey increased its military support to Kiev. The Russian leader has not yet begun to use Turkey's big move as a trump card for sanctions issues. However, the Ankara government does not seem likely to stop increasing its military aid to the Ukrainian army. Taking into account Putin's view, in fact, the intensity of Turkey's support for Ukraine should not surprise those who follow the country's foreign policy decisions in recent years. In 2019, Turkey was the only NATO member to intervene alongside the internationally recognized Libyan government against Khalifa Haftar's Russia-backed Libyan National Army. While it was never credited, Turkey's major intervention was the only thing preventing Russia from gaining a firm military foothold on NATO's southern border. This does not mean that Turkish foreign policy decisions that directly contradict Russia's interests do not carry great risks, because Turkey is currently faced with both internal and external threats from actors that receive support from Russia, or that may escalate Russia's support. Turkey has so far sent about 35 Bayraktar DB2 armed unmanned aerial vehicles, 24 mini Bayraktar reconnaissance UAVs, TRG-230 guided multiple rocket launchers, electronic warfare equipment, and 200 BMC Crimean RAPs. In addition to efforts to mediate between Ukraine and Russia, Turkey also sent mortar shells, artillery shells, and various weapons, ammunition, and a number of other aid packages to the Ukrainian army. In addition, Turkey's contributions to the Kiev army are direct investments in Ankara's own national and regional security. Because Ukraine plays a critical role in deterring not only Russia's aggression in the Black Sea, but also its power projection towards the Mediterranean. For this reason, we can consider the military assistance of Ukraine's brave ally, Turkey, to the Ukrainian armed forces as a guarantor factor for the peace of the Black Sea and the Mediterranean and the diplomatic security of the Western and Eastern European bloc. Ukraine, on the other hand, has chosen to keep publications about these deliveries to a minimum, rather than announcing the extent of all this military support by Turkey. Most deliveries from Turkey were only revealed after they were detected in Ukraine or reported by Ukrainian sources. Most of the weapons sent from Turkey to the Ukrainian army were donated, while the rest were sold at huge discounts. On the other hand, Turkey's help in the plight of Ukraine has not been entirely a matter of government. 5 Bayraktar DB2s are donated to Ukraine after crowdfunding organizations from Lithuania, Ukraine, and Poland met their funding goals. However, Turkish private defense firm Baykartek used the $32 million collected from Poland and Lithuania for humanitarian aid, defense, and reconstruction projects in Ukraine, and donated 5 Bayraktar DB2s to the Ukrainian army. Interestingly, these aids seem to be only half of the story. The Ukrainian government sources reported that Ukraine received about 15 more Bayraktar DB2s from Baykov for free, and 15 more were sold at a lower price. It was announced that this price covers only Beka's production costs. Beka also donated 24 mini Bayraktar reconnaissance UAVs to the Ukrainian armed forces. Unlike many of the other small reconnaissance UAVs delivered to Ukraine, these UAVs were scramble-resistant, a feature that was highly welcomed in Ukraine's battlefield environment. Rich in UAV development in the wake of recent reports of trying to help Ukraine, Turkey serves to emphasize its status as a loyal ally, supporting Ukraine's defense as a result, stating that Turkey supports Ukraine is of great importance. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg explained this issue in detail during a visit to Turkey. Stoltenberg urged President Erdogan to give the green light for Sweden and Finland's membership to the alliance. In addition to all these aids provided by the Ankara government to Ukraine, Ukraine is advancing step by step towards Crimea. The Crimean offensive is a plan that can change the balance of the world. So do we know the starting point, attack route, and infrastructure of this critical operation? Let's discover the hidden facts and the key center of the war together. The Donbas region, which has become the center of land offensive operations, perhaps witnessed many breaking moments of this war. But now, as the weather conditions improved and the sun started to illuminate the battlefield, Ukraine's southern front lines and the most important center of the war, the Crimean Peninsula, began to come to the fore. The fact that the Ukrainian leader Zelensky constantly stated in almost every statement that the war began in Crimea and will end there, perhaps offered us a secret clue. The message in these words may be telling us the steps of the Great Crimean Offensive Plan. The reason for this was that the southern front of Ukraine and the Crimean periphery had become the main target by the Ukrainian army in recent days. We understand the first sign of the continuation of the Great Crimean Offensive Plan from the critical attacks that took place in the city of Melitopol. Recently, the Ukrainian armed forces launched a stunning attack on the airport in Melitopol. The mayor of Melitopol, Ivan Fedorov, reported that the attack took place around 1 p.m. shortly after the first explosion at the airport. The second explosion greatly alarmed the residents and Russian military officials in Melitopol. Yes, the Ukrainian army was advancing step by step towards the Crimean Peninsula, the distance of approximately 230 kilometers between Melitopol and Crimea. And the fact that the peninsula could be targeted even from this area was considered a great advantage for the Ukrainian forces. And even now in Melitopol and Kherson, Ukrainian forces are trying to seize areas where they can gain a much broader perspective by using their airspace advantage. In this context, we can see that the sorties of Su-25 and MiG-29 warplanes, which are in the inventory of the Ukrainian Air Force, have captured the southern front lines of Ukraine, especially in recent days. The Ukrainian armed forces proved that they were very determined to create a connection corridor between the Crimean Peninsula and the southern front lines of Ukraine with the attacks they carried out on the airport in Melitopol, the next stop of the connection corridor, which is planned to continue Ukraine's Great Crimean Offensive Plan after Melitopol was the city of Armyansk, which is much closer to Crimea. And even on the borderline, Armyansk is seen by Ukrainians as a crucial offensive platform between the Kherson region and the Crimean Peninsula. With the acquisition of this area, Ukrainian forces can reach Yevpatoria with HIMARS long-range missile systems and GLSDB missiles. For this reason, a connection route that the Ukrainian army will create between Crimea and Kherson may even cause the peninsula to disappear from the hands of the Russians. In addition, if Crimea, which is in danger from all sides, is included in the Ukrainian army, it may even bring the Ukrainians to reach their borders in the former Soviet times and to end this war. When Moscow realized how serious the situation in and around the peninsula was, it ordered the air defense systems of the Russian army in Kherson to be sent to the Crimea, thinking that they could keep the peninsula much safer this way. The Russians ignored that. They gave the Ukrainians air superiority in regions such as Kherson, Zaporizhia, and Melitopol. In addition, the Russians cannot fully focus on the southern front lines as they are currently suffering heavy military losses on the front lines in the Donbass region. But it is predicted that both sides of the war will increase their offensives as weather conditions begin to improve. In the period when the clashes began to increase, the reflection of Russia's major problems in military ammunition on the Ukrainian front lines is one of the most fundamental factors that will affect the course of the war. The support Ukrainians receive from the US and the West in this regard will play a life-saving role. UK's Challenger 2 tanks, Germans, Leopard 2s, Poland and US M1 Abrams, as well as Poland's remaining Leopard 2 tanks are seen as the war gods of land clashes. Also, if Ukraine establishes a connection corridor to Crimea, its effective long-range missiles will perhaps be a very effective factor in shortening the duration of the war. At the moment, the Ukrainians are unclear at what stage of their plans for a major Crimea offensive, but on the one hand, the attacks of the Ukrainian forces have already blockaded Crimea. If you remember, since the last 3 weeks, the striking airstrikes of the Ukrainian armed forces have dominated the peninsula in the past days. 3 cities in Crimea were targeted by Ukrainians. Among the latest attacks on the peninsula, these cities were Bakhchisarai, Yalta and Gurzov as a result of the simultaneous air operations of the Ukrainian army. In these cities, quite severe explosions were heard. It was reported that these striking explosions occurred in areas close to the military facilities of the Russian army. In telegram groups which included residents of Crimea, it was stated that the explosions were heard even from civilian settlements. It was recorded that after the explosions in the rural areas of Bakhchisarai and Yalta, car alarms went off and the sounds of the explosions caused uneasiness among the civilian population. In addition, with these latest attacks, Russian military officials in Crimea and their families and relatives of soldiers in the Russian army came to the point of exhaustion from the socio-psychological effects of the war. Especially in recent days, the piers of Crimea have been overflowing with the inhabitants of Crimea, who are overwhelmed by the war and do not want to experience these effects and fears again. And even most of the inhabitants of the region living in Crimea saw the Ukrainians as justified in this war. In line with all this data, we can say that the great offensive plans of the Ukrainian armed forces against the Crimea are progressing successfully. It is not clear which city in Crimea will be their next target, but Russian officials in the peninsula do not know what to do. There is a desperate wait after the explosions in Crimea. We have witnessed this many times. Although the Russians claim that the Ukrainian forces are prepared for drone attacks, there is usually a constant atmosphere of chaos and panic on the peninsula after these attacks. On the other hand, the predictions about who will win the Crimea are increasing day by day. But according to a large group, Ukraine will regain Crimea because they have the supreme will and defend their homeland and are backed by a 50-nation coalition. Actually, this view makes quite a bit of sense if we consider that this war is a struggle of attrition. Russia's resistance may be broken after a certain period of time. In this way, the Ukrainians can take back what belongs to them, namely the Crimean Peninsula. Also, all the ammunition stocks are low. Ukraine's logistics are steadily improving thanks to the support of the coalition. Russia's logistics, on the other hand, are getting worse and worse thanks to sanctions, weak and corrupt governance over consumption, and Ukraine's precision weapons. Despite all this, according to the British Defense Minister, Ben Wallace, the Moscow administration currently has 97% of its active army in Ukraine. However, if you're aware, Russian forces are still unable to capture even the small town of Bakhmut in the east of the country, which is mainly defended by regional defense forces and National Guard units. How long do you think the Russians, who could not even capture Bakhmut, can hold the Crimean Peninsula? Considering the great plans of the Ukrainian forces in Crimea that we have told you about, the odds are increasing that the answer to this question is yes. Let's consider the answer from a much broader perspective. In fact, in order to liberate Crimea, it is necessary to first render the Russian army, navy, and air force dysfunctional in the peninsula. It could be part of the Ukrainians' plans to launch long-range strikes on the Kerch Bridge, the only land contact connecting Crimea to Russia. These areas, which connect Crimea to Russia via Mariupol and Melitopol, along the Kerch Bridge and the Sea of Azov coastline, which are already heavily damaged by the Ukrainian forces, are quite strategic. Any success of Ukrainian forces in these areas could allow them to reach much further inland of Crimea. It is then predicted the Ukrainians will move on to the second phase of their major Crimea, an offensive plan. In the second phase, we may see the re-emergence of Ukraine's drone army with Russia's military resources in the peninsula becoming dysfunctional. Ukraine's drone attacks will provide much more effective results if all these conditions are met. Unmanned aerial vehicle attacks by Ukrainian forces could consume the ammunition of Russian air defense systems in Crimea in the first place. Then Ukraine's second drone strike could severely damage the main target. Therefore, Ukrainians will have to choose their cards very carefully. At the moment, neither side of the war has a chance to make a mistake.